Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Job Hunter podcast with your host Tim French. My guest this week is well known for creating one of the most recognisable pieces of UK branding ever conceived, well, at least in my opinion. We will be discussing what goes on inside the exciting world of brand marketing and exclusively what goes into making a memorable identity for a brand through copywriting. I won't say any more for fear of spoiling the surprise, but while the intro is playing, see if you can have a think about which brand I'm talking about. As always, sit back, relax, grab your beverage of choice, and let's get on with this week's episode. I'm loving it, just do it, every little helps. Taglines and slogans that are instantly recognisable, right? Well, they didn't just appear out of thin air. These carefully thought out taglines are moments of inspiration that come to an important group of people, copywriters. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Ant Jackson, the mastermind behind some of the most recognisable slogans in the UK. Ant, why don't you start us off by giving our listeners a bit of a hint about what I'm alluding to?
Oh, okay. I guess it's a Lidl line, I suppose. It's a pun already. So I'm a senior copywriter / creative, depending on what you want to call me. For some reason, we've got two job titles just to confuse things even more. I wrote the tagline for Lidl, which is probably one of the most recognised bits of work I've done so far anyway.
So what is that for people that might not be as aware about Lidl's culture?
About Lidl's culture.
Sorry, the tagline itself.
So it's big on quality, Lidl on price. If you haven't heard of it, you've probably seen it in your peripheral on someone's carrier bag or on a shop window or something like that.
And so that's kind of a bit of an introduction into copywriting, but if we go a bit more in depth into what exactly is it, because I think to a lot of people the name of the job title doesn't really explain much about the profession. What exactly does it entail?
Yeah, it's funny actually, the name, because you'd think with it being writing, they would have come up with a slightly better name than copywriter, because it sounds like it's some sort of boring legal solicitor sort of stuff. Most people think it's that sort of small print at the end of a letter or something like that, or copyright. But it's actually nothing like that at all. So a copywriter or a creative is quite a varied job. So basically your role is to come up with ideas and concepts and words for brands, whether that be a tagline, whether that be a TV script, a radio script, it could be a social media post. It could really be anything that the brand wants to sort of put out there. So any communications on behalf of the brand, the copywriter will have come up with the words for that initially.
And is that quite hard? I guess trying to distill, what the brand is into such a small set of words effectively. What's the process involved in doing that?
Yeah, I'd say so. It can be. I mean, initially before sort of going into the industry, I remember sort of sitting there just listening to sort of jingles on the radio and thinking, oh yeah, I could just I'll just get this theme tune and I could just change the lyrics and it's not about that at all. It's there's a lot of work that goes into sort of getting those, I guess, 3 or 4 words that you have left over into a good place. So obviously it starts with the clients. They've obviously got objectives for their business or their brand. That then goes through to a team of people in a creative agency. And then you've got strategists who tend to research the audience and find out about sort of who we're speaking to, because of course you need to know about your audience, what they like, what they don't like, what drives them, what motivates them, all of those sorts of things, in order to really get to the emotional benefits or the things that are really going to sort of motivate them to think or act and listen to your brand. So yeah, the strategist will then come up with the sort of the proposition, which is kind of the clever bit of thinking, and the thing that we want to say. And then it's up to the creative team, which is made up of a copywriter and an art director. So the copywriter does the words, the art director is sort of in charge of the visuals, and they sort of come together and sit down to come up with an idea that's going to sort of get your attention. So how can we make something that could be quite dull slightly more creative, or actually emotional, or funny, or I don't know, shocking or surprising, etc. So.
And do you tend to kind of track with kind of social trends of the time? Do you try and mirror what's happening in the real world with your work, if that makes sense? Because I imagine some slogans wouldn't work now that they did 10 years ago, and vice versa. Do you have to be quite kind of abreast of current affairs and stuff like that?
Yeah, I suppose. So obviously you need to be current and you need to be relevant, but of course it depends on who you're talking to. There's no point doing a TikTok video when you're speaking to 60-plus-year-olds, for example. So again, it's all about just knowing who your audience is and what interests them and what drives them. So it could be about sort of keeping up with trends, but also like values are really important as well. And it's sort of those core beliefs at the end of the day, like the ones that you and I have, that are the things that determine the decisions that we're going to make. So it's sort of finding things that people feel strongly about, I suppose, and aligning with those values.
And have you had any kind of sticky points with a brand before, in the sense of like where they just really not got on with your idea or your thought process, and how do you kind of navigate those times where you're trying to put across your point creatively and they're not kind of understanding it?
Ooh, good question. I think sometimes, I guess the best test of an idea really is if I go into a room and I show something to a client and the client doesn't understand it within a couple of seconds, then how can I expect the general public to understand it? So really, unless there's something that they're just not seeing and everyone else in the room can see, holding something up to someone, the litmus test really is just going, do you get this? And if it's a no, then no one else is going to get it either. Yes, we have to do, I don't know, I've done hundreds of ideas and most of them have probably gone in the bin, but I guess sort of working in this role, you need to have that sort of energy about you where you can't be very precious about anything. You've just got to sort of keep going. And once you've created one idea, it's on to the next one. You can't sort of sit and dwell in the past. You've just got to keep going and keep coming up with new innovative ideas, really.
And can you remember that first client that you kind of did, or that first kind of slogan or tagline that was memorable to you? How did that feel, and what were you kind of, what was your thinking behind that one?
Lidl's probably the first sort of official tagline. So a lot of what I do normally is sort of headline writing or social media writing, website copy, TV, radio. So it's quite rare that you actually get to work on something like a tagline. So I was really lucky because I managed to do it within my first sort of few years in industry. But doing that was quite a shock, to be honest. Like I knew the tagline went into the meeting room with a load of others, and then my creative director, who he was the person who came up with Every Little Helps. So he was just this sort of big shot, and I was like, oh my gosh, he came up with Every Little Helps, and he came out of the room and just said, yeah, so they've chosen your tagline. And I was like, really? Which one? Because I think I'd handed him about 4 or 5. But I remember big on quality, little on price really stuck out as something that just, I think because of, one, the pun, and two, the fact that it's got that sort of those opposites, it's quite easy to remember. And when you're writing a tagline or any copy, really, it's so important. If you can get that to stick in someone's mind, and if you can get that to sort of be remembered sort of after the advert, then you're really onto something. It's kind of like song lyrics, I suppose. So if something can sound catchy and sound sticky, then yeah, it's probably going to be a success because you're probably going to remember it.
I was going to say, catchy is nothing more catchy than the McDonald's I'm Lovin' It, is it really? The Justin Timberlake song behind it. So I imagine that's really the good basis for a good slogan. Is it a catchy theme tune? Yeah,
I mean, as soon as you put music next to it as well, then it's going to be even catchier for sure.
And how do you get into something like copywriting? I don't imagine it's something you can necessarily just do at university in that sense, or is it? Do you have to kind of specialise into it, or where do you start with copywriting?
Yeah, so the industries, I think the ways in now are becoming much broader than they were when I started. So I had no clue how to get into it. When I first started out, I think I was about 15 when I first sort of discovered what it was. I remember analysing a movie poster in English, and I'd never thought about the amount of effort that had gone into creating something that really you're only going to look at for 3 seconds. But within those 3 seconds, you need to be able to decide whether or not you want to watch the film. So a lot of thinking has to go into that to make the audience go, okay, this is what it's about. And we pulled apart things like the font type and the words on there and the smoke on the screen and the color of the text and all these things that you don't really think about, but your mind's making a decision very quickly about them. And that's what I just found really fascinating. So I went to college. I did psychology, English language, and media studies, because I thought that was quite a nice mix of obviously sort of being interested in people and behavior is really important. Communication for English and sort of understanding how people speak and interact. And then also media studies. I've always been sort of quite creative. So I thought, I'm doing 2 quite academic subjects. I'd quite like to sort of get behind the camera and shout action and everything like that. And that's actually really helpful as well, because part of the job, you do end up being on shoots. You have got to sort of stand next to the director. You have got to sort of speak to the actors or the voiceover artist, etc. So it's all really useful. Then I did a BA in advertising and marketing. And then I worked in marketing for a year or so after that. I realized that I was in the boring end of the industry, basically. And there are some fun aspects to it, but for me, I just wanted to be sort of making the ads instead of looking at the budgets for them. So I did a course at Falmouth University. It's an MA course called Creative Advertising, and the course is sort of broken into a number of sections, but they sort of show you how to be strategic and how to come up with those sort of propositions that you need in order to refine your messaging. And then they also look at sort of art direction and copywriting as specialisms as well. And they also sort of taught us sort of basic Photoshop skills, which have come in handy as well from time to time. But there's lots of different courses out there. I mean, there's a few sort of universities. I think the most well-known ones are Bucks University. There's School of Communication Arts. West Herts College has got a really good course. It's called the Watford course. And those are the ones I can remember off the top of my head. But if anyone does want to sort of look into it, there's a really good website run by Young Creative Council, and there's a list of lots of different options on there. So it isn't necessarily something that you do have to go to university for these days. You could, there's some scholarships, for example, there's some part-time courses, and there's also a list of sort of emails so people can sort of reach out to people in the industry and just ask for some advice, really.
So it really is so much more than just writing a few words on a piece of paper. It's being creative. It's being, marketable yourself, and ultimately you need to get your point across well. So yeah, it sounds super interesting. In that sense, what is your kind of aspirations for your career? Or have you peaked now you've done Lidl, or is the sky the limit? Have you got more to do, more to say?
That'd be really sad if I'd peaked already. I think I'd become, oh God, I just imagine myself sat in a corner being grumpy. I don't know why I'm being grumpy and peak. I don't know what's going on. Aspirations, I think. So the next sort of stage for my career would be sort of going into creative direction. So all that really means is instead of coming up with all the ideas, I'll sort of work with the team and sort of help the team sort of refine their ideas and develop their ideas. So I guess that would be sort of the next stage. But for me, I think what I'd love to do, and the reason why I actually got into doing this in the first place, is because sort of I guess everyone's sort of got that dream where they kind of go, okay, what's my purpose in life, and what can I do, and what am I going to do by the time I die? What's going to be written on my gravestone, etc. And for me, I sort of never really knew what I wanted that to be, but I knew that I wanted to make a difference. So with that in mind, I thought, well, these days you don't really get very far if you're going to sort of tie yourself to a lamppost or go on a starvation strike or whatever else. You can't really get very far by doing those things. And I think activism is really sort of moving away from being on the streets and holding up a placard. And really you need to be able to have the skills to influence and to communicate with people in order to do a good job with that. And I feel quite fortunate to be working in times where actually brands are wanting to make a difference. There's a lot of brands who are sort of committing to certain sort of pledges, and they want to make a difference, whether that be sort of environmentally or for diversity. So it's a really nice time to be able to work with brands and help them sort of push those agendas. So we can actually sort of make the world a better place, really, because at the end of the day, brands have money to spend. So why not put that money towards good rather than just sort of selling cans of fizzy drink, etc., which is not why I got into the job at all.
And have you got any particular brands that you'd love to work with? Is there any brands that you think, oh yeah, I'd love to do something for them?
To be honest, any. It's hard to sort of say. I've worked with, God, probably 50 plus brands these days, and sort of where I'm working at the moment, they've got some brilliant sort of clients from, I don't know, Nestle, Virgin Money, Amazon, HSBC, Microsoft, BT. So they're big global brands. So they have a voice. And to be honest, I don't think it matters who the brand is. I think it's about sort of what your values are and what your purpose is and what your mission is, and what difference you want to make. And if you're sort of speaking your truth as a brand, then of course I'd love to work with you, because brands who walk the talk, I'd say, probably.
And you mentioned earlier how it wouldn't be appropriate to try and market on TikTok to 6-year-olds. How do you think the way you do your job has changed kind of in this social media era that we're in now and everything like that? Do you think you've had to adapt to that? Or, I mean, you might have, this might have been the way you've always done it, I don't know. But it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on how, especially how brands have had to adapt to an increase in social media use.
So initially, obviously my role probably just would have entailed print advertising and 30-second TV ads, and that would have probably been about it. Whereas these days, for the past sort of 10 years or so, I'd say social media has had sort of a lot of significance when it comes to sort of where you're putting your ad spend. TikTok is a fairly new one that I think it's sort of early days for TikTok. I think there's a lot of brands who are sort of waiting to see what other brands are doing. But it's an interesting shift, because what we're finding is sort of older audiences, for example, are more likely to sort of go to the cinema to watch a film, and they care about craft and they care about high production. Whereas younger audiences, actually, a lot of them don't trust brands in the same way. And actually, if they see something that's really shiny and really well polished, then actually it's not very authentic to them. And they just see it as another big brand or another big corporation speaking at them, instead of sort of being like them, I suppose. So TikTok in particular is quite interesting, because I think there's a lot of brands who are actually just watching and listening to young people and sort of letting them speak, which is why we're seeing things like influencers increase. Like there's so many sort of influencers on sort of Instagram nowadays, and more on TikTok, and those sort of avenues are becoming much more effective, just because they're real people talking about their passions and their values that just align with the brand. So I think there is a big shift, but there's still a role for sort of each piece of communications. Like TV isn't dead. People don't watch it as much, but on-demand adverts are still definitely a thing. You do need to sort of have a mix of different skills, I suppose. But I'm not an expert on TikTok. I have it, but my younger sister and my younger brother are much better at it than I am, for sure.
I have no idea about TikTok, so you're ahead of me. I think I'm struggling with Twitter, to be honest. So I think I'll probably give TikTok a miss for the moment. Do you think that some people might feel that copywriting is a bit of an underappreciated career path? I can imagine that a lot of people don't recognise the amount of hard work that goes into making a 3-word slogan and making it something that's so memorable, what would you say to those people that don't really understand the value of copywriting?
Yeah, I suppose so. It depends how you mean by underappreciated. I suppose it's quite different to, say, sort of if you'd written a film or a sitcom or something, your name isn't on there at the start or in the end credits or anything like that. But I don't think people get into it for those reasons. Like most people who I know who do the same sort of role as me, they're sort of natural problem solvers, or they're just creatives at heart, and they just sort of want to express, and they want to solve problems. And for example, I have a really overactive mind, so it's brilliant for me because every day they go, here's a new problem that you get to think about and try and come up with an answer to. So it depends where you see the reward. If you see the reward as sort of getting noticed and it being sort of seen as something sort of glitzy and glamoury, then yeah, maybe you should work in the world of fashion or in film. But the reality is, I suppose most people sort of on a film set, for example, you could also say that there's a lot of sort of roles there that are probably underappreciated because all you remember is, I guess, the director and the writer. But you've got the camera crew, you've got the sound guys, you've got the director of photography. There's all these sort of other people who most, I guess, the general public aren't really aware of, I suppose.
And are there any particular people in your industry that you kind of admire or look up to? I know you mentioned your boss wrote the "Every Little Helps" Tesco slogan. Is there any other kind of memorable people within your career sphere that you can think of?
Yeah, so there's a few sort of ad legends out there. I say Ogilvy is he's got an agency named after him. He was sort of one of the big people who really sort of, I guess, influenced the industry years ago. I'm quite lucky where I work now. The head of our creative department is a man called Steve Aldridge, who had his own agency for a while as well, and he's won numerous awards and worked on some really big brands. There's also a creative director called Joe Wallace, who will be a creative director where I'm working now as well, who I haven't yet met in person due to COVID, but very excited to. And what I love about her in particular is she, for example, had a TED talk that she gate crashed to talk about Black Lives Matter. She's done an awareness campaign about domestic violence with some really hard-hitting print ads during lockdown. And I guess it's people like that who are sort of standing out and sort of being proactive and doing different things in order to get very important messages heard. And I think that's very inspiring.
Amazing. If you could take yourself back to when you were a kid and kind of, what would you make of your career now? What would you say has surprised you about what you're doing now? Could you see yourself being where you are now when you were a kid?
Oh, no, probably not. I wanted to be a smoke jumper when I was a kid, which, if you don't know what that is, it's basically someone who jumps out of a helicopter with an axe to put out forest fires, which is a very particular job. And I have no idea how I would have done it in England because we don't even really have fires. It really wasn't until I was about, I guess, 15 that I really sort of heard about this job at all. There's a film with Mel Gibson in it called What Women Want, and I think that was the first time that I remember sort of seeing the job in real life. And in this film, he basically he got struck by lightning, and all of a sudden he could hear the thoughts of all of these women, and then he ended up using these thoughts that he overheard in order to create a new advert for Nike women's division. And I was just like, oh, well, what's that? Like, it's very creepy. And actually the advertising world isn't creepy like that at all. It was just so happened that Mel Gibson was in this film. But it was just really eye-opening, I suppose. But yeah, being creative has always been something I've loved doing. I used to do a lot of painting, and I wasn't actually that into writing up until I was probably sort of 18 plus. But yeah.
So what kind of advice would you give to any prospective creative writers, whether that's journalism, PR or social media? What would you say to someone who's, is say 16 and thinking about their career more seriously, about pursuing this path?
I'd say probably practice. I think with pursuing any career, don't do it because you think it's going to sort of end up paying you well or anything like that. Like inevitably you can do well in anything, but if you enjoy it, then you're going to be better at it. So I think bear in mind that this is something that you're kind of committing your whole working life to, potentially. So yeah, follow what you love. And if it's not bringing you joy, then I'd say quit early, because you don't want to find that out sort of 20 years down the line. Thankfully, I think with this career, it does bring a lot of joy. It is high pressure, and it can be very stressful. You do have to pull some really long hours sometimes, but again, I think that's sort of changing, and things are getting better. There's sort of more aware, people are becoming about things like mental health, for example, and sort of how important sort of that work-life balance is. But yeah, I think for copywriting in particular, definitely sort of focus on your English and sort of being creative, whether that be sort of reading, watching shows. I think you're only as good as sort of if you've got this constant output, which you do have to, every single day you've got to come up with sort of ideas. You need to feed your brain somehow. So watch movies, go to the theatre when we're allowed to, listen to music, try songwriting, try stand-up comedy. It doesn't really matter. You can just, whatever you're sort of drawn to that's creative, just fill your mind with it, because you can use all of that as inspiration for coming up with sort of ideas. So,
do you have a little black book of ideas that you write down in every day, or is it something all stored up in your head?
Yeah, there's the odd sort of thought that sort of I'll have when sort of being in conversation with someone, or some sort of insight, and I'll be like, oh yeah, that'd be really good for a brand like this. Most of the time I don't happen to be working with a brand like that at the time, so it ends up going in this folder on my notes called bottom drawer. So most of them don't see the light of day. But yeah, each brief that you get from a brand is specific to a certain problem or objective. So a lot of the time you can't just sort of have a bank of ideas that you go, oh, I've been saving this one. Finally, the day's come to create this ad that I thought of 7 years ago. It doesn't really work like that. It'd be nice if it could, because we probably have some really entertaining ads out there. But
I was going to say, it's a shame really, because I'd love to hear one of these bottom drawer slogans that you've got on to hand, but I'm afraid probably don't, do you?
I don't know, and that's probably a good idea anyway. They're probably a load of rubbish. But
Excellent. So if we can move on a little bit, I do a little segment which I've christened Tim's 3 tips. I'm still not sure about the name of this segment. I think I personally hate the idea of it, but I'm going to run with it. Basically, the premise of it is that I get my very knowledgeable guests to give me 3 little tidbits of advice on a particular topic. So it'd be great if you could kind of give us some advice on how to be persuasive or grab someone's attention when writing. So that's whether that's for a book or an essay, or even just a witty Instagram caption. What 3 bits of advice would you give someone who's doing a bit of creative writing?
how to, sorry, do you mind repeating that?
Yeah, that's fine. So 3 tips on how to be persuasive or grab someone's attention when writing, whether that's a book, an essay, or some kind of witty Instagram caption.
Oh, how to grab someone's attention. Oh, there's so many ways. I think sort of depending on what it's for, like being provocative can be really good. Sort of push the boundaries a bit, again, depending on what it is. If people are used to seeing something like what you're writing, they're probably less likely to engage with it. So think about sort of where you could flip something or give it a twist. And if you can do that earlier, especially, for example, on social media, like we know our attention spans are, I think it's something like it takes 1.7 seconds for someone to decide whether or not they're going to interact with something on social media these days, which is incredibly quick, and we all do it, even if we're not aware of it. So getting something sort of upfront is really important, I think, especially if it's online, and sort of getting people interested within the sort of top section of the article. So giving it a punchy headline, sort of putting a bit of humour in there can always be really useful, but keep it short, because a lot of the time people tend to sort of go, oh, if I'm writing, it means that I have to write a lot. With copywriting, it's kind of the opposite. Unless you're writing a long copy ad, you need to say whatever you need to say in as little words as possible. So be concise, try and add some sort of humour, be provocative. That's 3, isn't it? There we go.
Well done. You mentioned the C word earlier. I've been trying to not say it too much, but how would you say the way you've worked has obviously changed in the last year? I can't believe we're nearly coming up to a year of this, but you know, is it harder to do your job virtually or without actually interacting with people?
It is and it isn't. So some parts of my job involve coming up with sort of concepts for ideas, and for that I'll often work with someone to do that. So I'll sort of bounce with an art director or a designer. In person it's so much easier because you've got body language, you've got a room, you can stick things up on a whiteboard, you can sort of write all over it. That I really miss, and I look forward to getting back to doing that. But at the same time, if I've got background noise, if I'm writing and I just need to get my head down, an office environment can be an absolute nightmare because there's music playing, someone's got their dog barking, someone's having a catch up at the coffee machine, and it's just, yeah, it can just be a little bit hectic. So I do like the fact that I can sort of get away and have some peace and quiet. But yeah, I do miss the collaborative element of sort of being in the same room as someone.
Did I hear that correctly? Someone had their dog bark. Are you allowed to bring your dogs into the office?
In some agencies, we have we'll have 1 or 2 dogs around if they're well behaved. But yeah, depending on who's managing the building, you can bring your dog.
I mean, I might make a career change just with some more dogs in my life. That sounds like the dream.
It's not bad.
Excellent. So this one is kind of like a 2-part question. It's probably going to be my last proper question. What do you think is, the hardest aspect of your job, and what do you also think is the most rewarding aspect of your job?
You know what? It's probably the same thing in a way. The hardest thing. So they say it doesn't matter how much experience you have. Every single time you get given a new brief, you don't know the answer and you're back to square one, basically. So every time you kind of go, there's this, they call it the creative process, and there's a few memes online. But it's like something like you get the brief, then you start effing and blinding about how ridiculous it is. Then you start panicking. Then you do all the work whilst you're crying. And then finally you realise that you've got the answer. Then you feel really good about it. Then you give yourself a pat on the back, and then you go back to square one again and start again. So yeah, the hardest thing is probably that moment of panic when at first you go, oh God, this is really exciting. And then you go, oh no, but how am I going to be able to come up with something like that? And then after some time and after some thinking and actually sort of getting down to focus, you sort of think you've cracked it. And it's not until obviously sort of that gets put in front of the creative director and the client. And then if it gets made, and then if it's successful, you then go, oh, right, yeah, I did do it. Oh, that's quite good. And I guess it's that, the dread, but also the kind of like, the reminder that, oh yeah, you can actually do this. This is and I think everyone, no matter what their level, always still feels that bit of imposter syndrome, really, I suppose. But it's nice just to sort of see it out there in the world and see people appreciate it and actually like it. That's the best sort of thing, because you don't want to be sort of involved in an ad that everyone sort of presses skip ad on YouTube. You want to be involved in the ones that everyone goes, oh gosh, have you seen this? Or look what they did, that's really fun. And that's the sort of stuff that I think is most rewarding.
I promise this is my last question.
Oh, good.
It sounds like it's quite a steep mountain to climb when you first get given that initial brief. How do you kind of break it down so it's a little less scary, or a little less anxiety inducing? Because it sounds like it could be at times.
Yeah, it can be. I think strategists are awesome people because they actually help condense things. So the client will probably give the agency, I don't know, a 2 or 3 page document, or if they're a great client, they'll give them a page. And then the strategist will sort of pull that apart, pick out the most important things and condense it. So you're not massively overwhelmed when you're the creative getting given that brief. But there is obviously still a lot to think about. And I think there's also that pressure of just sort of having to solve something that can sort of feel like a big responsibility. The best thing to do really is just to write everything down, no matter how stupid or ridiculous it sounds. It can quite often be like a half-baked idea that someone will actually see a little bit of gold in, and they may be able to build on that and sort of turn it into something that's really effective. So it's just about not doubting yourself and just thinking, no matter how ridiculous you think it is, no matter how stupid it is, or even if you think, no, they'll never buy that idea or that'll never go anywhere, write it down anyway. And then just sort of go through, if you've got sort of a day to sort of reflect on it, go back the next day, look at it with fresh eyes, but just write everything down. And just sort of keep going, really, because then I guess you don't really have time to think about the sort of stress and the worry and everything else. Yep.
And thank you so much for coming on to talk to me today. It's been very enlightening. I literally knew nothing about this before I spoke to you, so I've learned a lot myself. Where can people find out more about you, more about your work if they want to? I'm sure we'll see your stuff dotted around billboards in the near future.
Yeah, sure. So you can follow me on Twitter if you want. So it's @jackson_, or on my website, antjacksoncreative.com. So yeah, feel free to check it out. Drop me a sort of message or anything if you've got any questions. I'm happy to help.
Amazing. Thank you again. Thanks very much for your time. And yeah, I look forward to seeing your work everywhere soon.
Well, good. Thanks for inviting me on.
A massive thank you to Ant for coming on. And if you want to find out more about her work, you can find Ant on Twitter @antjackson_ or at www.antjacksoncreative.com. Thank you to everyone that listened to the show and for all your support so far, but our work is not done. I need you to help me grow the show by subscribing, liking, sharing and leaving reviews so that others can see and hear what we're all about. It takes literally 30 seconds and helps us out massively. If you're not already, feel free to follow us on social media. It's @JobHunterPod on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, where you can also find our support group where I post helpful extras from the show to any budding job hunters out there. As always, thank you very much for listening to the show. I've been your host, Tim French, and I'll catch you next time for another episode of the Job Hunter Podcast.